No one ever reached a state of peace through personal efforts or personal endeavor or personal willpower. No one ever won a state of peace or achieved it or attained to it. It was never the prize for any kind of behavior, no matter how exemplary or skillful, no matter how disciplined you might be, no matter how skillful you might be, and no matter how persistent you might be, you're never going to attain to a state of peace. And we can say that with an awful lot of assurance. We can see that that's not a possible thing just by considering what peace means. And what peace means is a state of affairs that isn't fragile. It isn't the result of any maneuvering or manipulation or any effort. Effort is kind of like rolling a big stone uphill. Now we can roll a big stone uphill, and even though it's hard work, we can do it. But that's a precarious situation, because what goes up must come down, and we're probably going to have to stay there, keeping an eye on the stone and propping it up so it doesn't come rolling down again. All of our purposeful effort is of this nature. It's like rolling boulders uphill, up a steep hill. And what keeps us going is a particular fantasy, which is endemic. And that fantasy is that by being persistent enough, we'll reach a point where we don't, not only do we not have to push anymore, but we don't have to safeguard anymore. So this is winning in the biggest possible way. It's being an ultimate winner. It's being a winner where you've won so successfully that you never have to struggle again. And that's what fuels all our struggling in finite play. The struggling is wearisome and tedious and repetition, which is to say we don't love the struggling for its own sake in finite play. The only reason we struggle in finite play is to reach an end to that struggle. As James Cass says, or as Gurdjieff says, we're like some fella rowing around in a boat, rowing here and rowing there, in the hope of finding somewhere that they won't have to row anymore. So the effort that they're putting into it is fueled by the hope that one day they'll reach the point where they don't have to row anymore. But when it's peace we're talking about, that is a myth. It's never going to happen, because when we're struggling, all we're ever going to find is the need for more struggle. So conflict leads to conflict. Conflict does not lead to peace, obviously enough. And if I have to impose my will on the world to create peace, then that so-called peace is the result of my efforts, which means I have to keep the efforts up. Because as soon as I stop, then that so-called peace evaporates like the illusion it is. Now, all of this, when spelled out, makes abundant good sense, and probably very few people are going to deny it or try and argue against it. No one's going to try and say you can fight for peace. But at the same time, this is exactly what we do with therapy, mental health therapy, psychological therapy. Because what is it that we want to attain at the end of the therapeutic work. And no matter how we might frame it, it all comes down to peace in the end. That's the only thing that really matters. And especially when we've actually been subsumed within neurotic struggle for a long, long time, the longer we get caught up in it, the more we realize the preciousness of peace and how only peace will bring what we want, that nothing else at all, fame, fortune, status, admiration, enviable situations of one sort or another, we learn that lesson that actually it's peace we want. No prizes for any games. So at a certain stage of life, it's all about the prizes that come at the end of various games, and we knock ourselves out looking for these prizes. But when we get wiser, we realize that these prizes just bring more conflict and more struggle, as I've just said. So when we get wiser, we realize that it's peace. Peace is the only thing of any value. Peace is the precious benediction. Peace is the thing that feels, the only thing that heals our pain. So what we're looking for is an end to the conflict, end to the self-contradictions, an end to the self-sabotaging, an end to the fighting. And there is absolutely no way that we can win that state of being. It's not the outcome of a successful effort, which is very hard for us to process because the be-all and end-all for us is successful effort. What could be greater than successful effort? And the reason we idolize successful effort so much is because we're idolizing personal will, which means that we're idolizing the ego. So really, the emblem that or prize that we receive at the end of successful effort is an adornment for the ego. It's the glory of the ego that we're talking about here. And all the ego or mind-created self is ever interested in is its own glory. And that single-minded interest of it is what leads it on in unending conflict, and followed by conflict, followed by conflict, because it's so desperate for its personal glory, and that personal glory is so intensely attractive to it. There's nothing as exciting as that. There's nothing with as much power to draw us on and on. But the glory of the ego is the fantasy of the ego. There can never be this state of glory that can be attained by the ego. And we know that very well indeed. And the reason we know that very well indeed is because there is no ego. So there can't be any glory for the ego. Which is fairly simple to understand. Now, the funny thing is that in our understanding of what is necessary to do when we are afflicted by mental ill health, mental suffering, mental conflict, our collective societal understanding is that we have to struggle against it. Of course, we have to battle anxiety. We have to beat depression. We have to win out. And this terminology, we have this terminology coming out of us, coming out of our ears, coming out of all parts of us. It just oozes out of us the whole time. Because that's what we think. It's what we believe in. We believe in successful struggle. We believe in struggle that gets vindicated and validated, and struggle which leads to glory. So we are completely sold on this. And we could think that when it comes to the field of therapy, clearer thinking is required. You need to look at things a bit more clearly, just as a nuclear physicist would look at his or her field more clearly, because there's no room for bland, easy assumptions that are never examined. We need something a bit more than that. But unfortunately, we don't really seem to have anything more than that in the general run of things. We keep going on and on and on about the winning and the fighting and the struggling and the never say die, and keep on trying and trying and trying again. We cannot help idolizing personal will. And this isn't just an attitude that comes from one particular area. It comes from all sides. In Grow, for example, they say that action precedes motivation, which means if you don't feel the motivation, you keep on doing it and doing it and doing it until eventually the motivation comes. And personally, I would think that someone who has been through year after year of mental suffering should be wiser enough to not to subscribe to this nonsense, because what it really means is keep on banging your head against the wall, and one day what always has happened in the past is going to stop happening and everything's going to be okay. That keep on trying and trying and trying, and just because the trying seems to make things worse, don't worry, keep on trying because eventually it'll work. That kind of an idea. But all of that always comes down to the personal striving of the mind-created self, trying to, if not win glory, because that's not really the right word to use in this situation, win release, or salvation, or redemption, or a state of healing, or state of peace. But none of those things are ours to manipulate. And by persisting with the action, that's us manipulating. We've got this idea, if I do X, then Y is going to happen. It's like saying that if we keep on smiling and keep on pretending to be happy and keep on being upbeat and not giving in to the old negative thoughts, eventually that will yield the prize of us really being happy, of us really being in good form, of it actually being genuine. So fake it until you make it. But this is manipulation, because it's the same thing. Do X and then Y will happen. So we keep on feverishly doing X because we're desperate for Y to happen. Therefore we're trying to manipulate, which means we're fighting or we're struggling, or that's all we know is manipulating. And it can come in lots of shapes and sizes, and it can come in lots of different guises. But manipulating is manipulating, and there's no way to manipulate ourselves to a situation of good mental health. There's no way to manipulate ourselves to peace. So this brings us back to Rumi's quote, "When you give up your tricks, that will be your cleverest trick." This is the one thing that we don't hear so much. We're not told to give up our tricks, or we're not advised to see through our tricks or see what happens when we stop with the tricks. We're just given new tricks, apparently super duper scientific research based tricks, supposedly. But it doesn't matter a damn. All the research in the world can't make it possible for manipulation to end up in peace and bring us to a place of peace. And we know that cannot be so. We don't even need to bother with the research. And I think all this rattling on about research betrays a deep misunderstanding of what science means. Science is not just research. Science is an understanding of the deep principles. And when we understand the deep principles, we can try and test those deep principles by doing some research. But we don't have any understanding of any deep principles. We just know what we want, and so we have all these tricks, and we keep trying the tricks, and we try and do the research to see which tricks will work or which tricks work best. If we understood the deep principle that we can't control our way to a state where we don't have to control anymore, or that we can't manipulate our way to a state of inner peace, then maybe we'd do a different type of research, but we certainly wouldn't be trying over and over again to validate different forms of struggle as if there are some forms of struggle that actually work. And this message is definitely one that we can find in fairy tales. And the motif in a fairy tale that resonates most with this message is really the motif of the struggle for the precious elixir of healing, or the elixir of immortality, or whatever precious kind of elixir it is. Or maybe something else, maybe not even an elixir. That there is this quest, and often it would take the form that the king's sons, because it's needful to make this quest to save the king's kingdom, or to save things in general, the sons are sent off and to see who could be successful on the quest. And so you've always got this thing where often you've got this thing where there's the oldest son who's very focused and matter of fact and driven and ambitious, and you've got the youngest son. The motif of the youngest son is that he's a bit of an idiot, happy-go-lucky, a bit soft, really, a bit of like he's to be discounted right from the start, really. So the eldest son goes about things in his way, and he's ruthless. He knows what he wants, and he's ruthless. It's not to say that he isn't smart, because he is smart. It's not to say that he isn't strong, because he is strong. He's very directed, and he is strategizing his way towards the goal. But if you know anything about fairy tales, then we know that he ends up with egg on his face. He ends up looking like a right plonker, because that's what happens in the fairy tales. So, for example, the trail leads through a forest, and the eldest son sees various small forest animals needing his help. It could be a bird with its wings trapped in a bramble bush, or it could be a deer or a stag with its antlers entwined in something else. And I can't really remember all the different variations of this, but each one entreats the older brother, help me, my wings are all caught up, help me, my antlers are all entwined. And he always says, sort yourself out, I've got a job to do, I haven't got time to be wasting my time with idiots like you. Get out of that mess. It's your mess, you get out of it. I haven't got time to be, I'm on an important quest, you know. I haven't got time for that bullshit. So he shoots on ahead and he ignores all of this because he's single-minded and he's just got his goal in his head and that's all he cares about. And then you get the youngest brother, and of course he's good-hearted and he's ruled by his heart. He's not single-minded. He's not an example of someone who's rationally orientated. So he helps the little bird, frees the bird, and he frees the stag, and he frees all the other creatures, even though it costs him time and he's way behind in the race, so to speak. But in the end, of course, what happens, even though this was not his plan, all the forest creatures come to his aid in the end, and thus he gains the prize. He finds the elixir, whereas the older brother ends up making a right idiot of himself and fades out of the story. Now that can be taken on a superficial level as just a kind of a way of engaging the listener of the story, a kind of a nuance in the story that makes it a bit more interesting. But psychologically speaking, it's a very, very strong message, and what it means is that what it is that we seek is never ever going to be won by strategizing, by heading towards the goal, by trying to get the goal and ignoring anything that has nothing to do with the goal. It's not going to be won by the rational intellect. It can only come about when we are being true to ourselves and good-hearted without a view to the outcome the whole time. And when we're not having the outcome on our mind the whole time and gearing everything we do towards this outcome, then that outcome comes true because we're not striving for it, because we aren't single-minded, because we're not fixated on goals. Okay, thanks for watching.